Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. We're coming to the end of Season 2 and I'm starting to plan for the next 2 seasons. Producing a podcast is not free and it takes time to get things right. So if you're enjoying this podcast and think it's worth $2 a month, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. Or just visit the website, foreigncountries.podbean.com, and click the Patron button. Thank you for your support. Today my guest is Dave Johnston. Dave was the first qualified Australian Indigenous archaeologist. He has worked as a consultant archaeologist for more than 30 years on thousands of projects. He's the chair of the Australian Indigenous Archaeologists Association, and now he's the Australian National University's Indigenous Community Engagement Coordinator. We're going to talk a little about his life and career as an archaeologist, but particularly about the practice of researching and protecting Indigenous archaeology in Australia. So welcome, Dave. Let's start with your own story, which is quite extraordinary, and I know that you got hooked on archaeology at an early age.
Well, hi Ash, thanks very much for having me on and hello to your audience. My name's Dave Johnston. I'm an Aboriginal fella from North Queensland. We call ourselves Murrays. I was born in the 60s and I am part of the tail end of what they call the stolen generations. I was adopted out into a white family. My beautiful family, the Johnstons, adopted 5 kids. And so I'm part of this multicultural Indigenous family with 2 non-Indigenous folks and been blessed to have a beautiful family. My dad was a lighthouse keeper. And I grew up on the Great Barrier Reef on 5 different islands, including 5 years up in the Torres Strait, where I also went to school. So I don't have my own set country because I'm still searching for my family and the history. And I'm doing this as we speak for this Christmas. It's a lifelong journey when you're tracking down your roots and your connection. My interest in archaeology began because I was doing correspondence school because I was on a remote island with my wonderful mother, Kath, who's an English teacher and a principal by trade, worked for many years in education and in Indigenous communities. So one day when I was 11, I came back exploring the caves up in the Booby Island in the Torres Strait, also known as I said, Mum, this is fascinating, finding all this stuff and discovery. She said, I know you're interested in history. Maybe you want to be an archaeologist. I said, oh, what's that? And being a good English teacher, she said, look it up in the encyclopedia. So I went over and dusted off the Encyclopedia Britannica 1958 or 9 or whatever it was and read the description for archaeology and what an archaeologist is. And my beautiful mum rang the state and she harassed this wonderful professor, John Campbell, who was professor of archaeology at James Cook University. And as it happened, he said he was going up with a crew to the Chiligo caves to do a week's excavation. But part of that team was one of Australia's greatest paleontologists, David Happold, who wrote and prepared the IAX's map of Aboriginal language groups of Australia we use today. We went off to Chiligo, had a wonderful week. It was before the time of consultation with Indigenous people, so we were working on site. But during it was this catalyst, and this is like the boys' own adventure book story. I went on my tea break, or smoko as we call it here, and explored the caves of Chiligo. I went down this tunnel way, about 30 metres actually. And I looked up on the wall and there was these claw bones and a big jaw mineralizing like they were jumping out of the wall. And I went, oh my God, this is like a monster jumping over. I raced up to Bruno. Bruno, there was all these bones down there. And I knew that David was a paleontologist. He said, come on, show me. He went down and had a look. Bruno dropped the torch and said, wait there, ran off to get the John Campbell and David Happold. And they all came down. They all jumped up and down and said, this is what we've been looking for. And this is wonderful. And we're going to call this Johnston's Gallery. Anyway, as it happened, they did excavations later when I went back to school. And it was a giant diprotodon, what David was looking for in the megafauna, of Australia's megafauna. And for me, even though it wasn't the cultural side of archaeology, that was enough for me to go, yes, this is my career. So that got me hooked. So became an archaeologist through the ANU, graduated with honours in 1989, a combined major in archaeology and anthropology at the Australian National University. I was privileged to get a scholarship and went overseas and did a master's. 1991-92, I did my master's at the Institute of Archaeology, which gave me a ticket to ride, and I've been working as an archaeologist ever since.
So when you came back from London, how did you become a professional archaeologist?
And I came back, I worked at the Australian Heritage Commission as Australia's Indigenous Heritage Liaison Officer. I travelled around the country liaising with hundreds of Aboriginal communities about heritage, which gave me the opportunity, because as being a stolen gen, I didn't grow up with, knowing who my parents were, my community. So I had to go out as we say, as a green skin, Indigenous fellow with a great education, but with not much community backing knowledge, which has taken me a lifetime to achieve, and who I am today. But I had to go out, meet communities, have my baptisms of fire. But now I'm adopted into 13 communities, and I have more skin names, and I get called up to do native title claims because I've got 30 years experience taught by the grand folks. So I'm very, very privileged, both with my education, the family adopted me, and the opportunities I've been afforded, but also those many Indigenous elders who have taken me and mentored me. But I also then set up an Aboriginal company with Australia's first Indigenous archaeologists back in '93 called Australian Archaeological Survey Consultants, with Sam Wickman, Steve Free, who's now deceased, myself, and our non-Indigenous colleague, Stuart Hoyes. And we had a wonderful company, did that for many years. I've done over 3,000 heritage projects as a consultant. I would say that my uniqueness is I work for Aboriginal communities direct. They employ me and then they consult with companies. So I'm their preferred archaeologist. I worked in Canberra, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, stick to the eastern states. Later, my second company from 2007 until to this day, in 2000, still going, is Aboriginal Archaeologists Australia. At stages, I've had 18 archaeologists on. Other times, I've just been working myself.
And what does that work involve?
I do archaeological heritage assessments for part of environmental impact assessments. But I also get a lot of communities. I've taken on 13, 15 mining companies who've deliberately destroyed sites, or state governments who have allowed this to happen. And I've been asked, and I go in with maverick lawyers or whatever I can afford to go and take these ones on. We're the controversial, but this is what Indigenous archaeologists do. We are the custodians. And this is a different part which I'm pleased to be able to talk about, because someone's got to look after our country and heritage and not just appropriate it. I did a lot of ethics things, so I've set up codes of ethics, like the WAC Code of Ethics, the Australian Archaeological Code of Ethics, the first guidelines for consulting Indigenous peoples about Indigenous heritage. I was involved with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies guidelines for ethical research with Chrissy Grant and the committees. These frameworks which were developed with Indigenous people's voices.
So that brings us up to date. What are you working on now?
Currently, today, in 2020 and onwards, I work with that many Aboriginal communities, but now I'm working at the ANU, Australian National University, where I've just finished doing a year's contract as the ANU's Indigenous Community Engagement Coordinator. It's an area dear to my heart, trying to make cultural change within the Australian National University, which, like all universities in Australia, suffer from very westernised approaches, privileges, and it's time we did a bit of truth-telling and sharing the privilege to ensure that Indigenous partners, students, employees, and opportunities are afforded to those less privileged in Australia, and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities. I love ANU. I'm the biggest advocate. I haven't ever left there, really. I'm very proud of ANU and where we're going collectively. There's more Indigenous peoples there, staunch ones, and collectively we're working together to improve our communities' engagement, partnership, employment, representation and voices within the Australian National University, and showcasing for all academic institutions, no longer appropriating the Indigenous heritage, but actually partnering with peoples and getting the maximum benefits out of that wonderful partnership. I'm working on a project. We've had, from the post-fires, we've had 6 very ancient old boomerangs coming out of the banks, out of the creeks, that the communities from Boomerang in Melbourne to the South Coast Eden to the Ulladulla communities have contacted me and asked if we could find out how old these are. So I'm working with my colleague Duncan Wright at the School of Archaeology and Anthropology, where we've set up a Indigenous partnerships program where we're being able to do these projects for communities. So we're getting some exciting dates, I won't list now, coming through of these ancient boomerangs, getting them conserved and handing them back to the community and with a report. So this is about partnerships. This is about, we're getting the benefit of working with these communities, and the communities are getting the benefits of the resources of the university. This is the equitable partnerships that we're trying to encourage around the country. But excitingly, on top of that, so the ANU have offered me a scholarship to do this and employment work to do that. in recognition what I've been lobbying for and have done for the ANU on the Indigenous front. But part of that is to do with my PhD, and I'm excited. I'm going back to the ANU and the School of Archaeology and Anthropology. So my PhD topic is called One Place, Many Stories, Australian Indigenous Community Archaeologies from Within. And this is an area that I'd like to talk about. It's going back, my career of 35 years. I'm going back, and I've got to successfully manage to get a grant that will engage 5 communities I've worked with for over 25 or 30 years.
Which communities?
The Mitakudi in Cloncurry, the Kuthan in the Gulf of Carpentaria I've worked with for 35 years, doing the heritage projects from the Century Zinc Mine. We did hundreds of projects. Any development project, we do the cultural heritage assessment. The Ngunnawal and Ngambri communities here in Canberra, I've worked with for over 35 years, recorded many of the sites in the area. For the sites, we're dealing with one today, the Mount Ainslie site, which has been threatened by development. We're getting its Indigenous values recognised and protected. The Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area, the 3 traditional tribal groups out there, the Nyampa, Barkindji and Muddy Muddy, who also adopted me in at the time. Privileged because they engaged me as their consultant to write in the early 2000s the World Heritage Management Plan, looking at their aspirations. We're trying to get independence for our communities and have their own voice. It's something somewhat lacking in many situations in Australia. At the time at Lake Mungo, which is part of the Willandra World Heritage Area, the national parks, that was a community I worked for many years doing their heritage, doing projects. They're still struggling to get an independent voice out there at Lake Mungo to manage their heritage and their amazing ancestral remains. Academics will not let the handcuffs go to those boxes of remains. I liaised with them to get their aspirations because it wasn't coming out with governments, and it's still not. But other times we were managing the ancient footprints. I was dealing with every archaeologist who wanted to come and make their name in the World Heritage Area, which they still do, and trying to adjudicate and get some proper processes so the elders were in charge of the process. And that when we got people in, they had a job to do and finish. But people want to continue because it's such a World Heritage Area for its amazing remains and the antiquity of Mungo man and Mungo woman. So we have to protect the elders' interests, their aspirations, and ensure that people aren't appropriating the heritage and history and the people, which has been happening since archaeology started in Australia. And the Boomwurrung in Melbourne, with Auntie Carolyn Briggs, who I've worked with forever, and the South Coast Elders Council. And what we're doing is basically doing a digital mapping project with a colleague, going back, seeing the stories or places or projects that the community want to do. The Mitakudi will be looking at their native title and cultural tourism. The Kuthan are looking at mapping country. We're going out for a project, the elders are being paid. So I want to go back to showcase. This is archaeology in Australia, not at a top level in an ARC grant, who's got the biggest trowel or the oldest date. This is blackfella archaeology by blackfella archaeologists who are in touch with the communities, what their priorities are. This is a whole field of Australian archaeology. We are doing the work, and I want to reflect that in what is community archaeology. I'd like to call it Indigenous archaeology. As Robin Bancroft said, who's the first female Indigenous archaeologist, we've been doing our work and projects for years. No one knows about it. It's not in the university books and it's not in the consultancy. But I really want the world to know that how and to do meaningful archaeology is come and look at us and what we've been doing.
So how are you bringing all these projects together?
The PhD then will allow, thank you for the communities I've worked with for over 30 years. Well, I'm adopted in their work, their trust, which is what I'm giving back now. But it showcased what, the other side of what archaeology could be and should be through Indigenous voices, aspirations, and people who care about those aspirations. Because if non-Indigenous people go out and work and stuff up, they can walk away. We as Black and Indigenous archaeologists can't. It's our communities, our reputations, and our well-being and ability to work there.
So how do you plan to pass on your skills and knowledge to the next generations?
So as a stolen generation child, it's been a big part of my life because I've been mentored by countless elders. I am a reflection of that. That's why I can work in so many states and territories and have been asked to represent communities in my career, which I do now with courage and conviction. I still have these wonderful mentors, and I'd like to name from Uncle Albert Mullett from the Gunai, Auntie Dr. Matilda House from the Ngunnawal Ngambri of ACT, Auntie Caroline Briggs, my great mentor, Kay Mundine. I'd like to mention her. She was a wonderful activist. The Kuthan, many, the list goes on. I'd like now, as I'm in my 50s, I've still a long career to go, but I want to be able to give that back to students, not Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to actually have the strength and courage to protect, stand up for Indigenous people's voices, not just strictly looking after your own career, your own advancement. That's important, that will come. But you need to look after other people's. And if you're working in Indigenous heritage in Australia, you have to respect our heritage.
And who are the next generation, in fact?
Indigenous archaeologists coming through with their PhDs. We had Ron Heron, who was given an honorary doctorate in 2014. We've had Chris Wilson from Flinders Uni, got his doctorate. Dr. Kelly Pollard, my colleague, and we've got Cal Elwood from Cairns. So we've got some great PhDs there. Hopefully I'll get mine before they wheel me out. And these are our leaders for the future. And we're setting this up, and we'll be discussing, and I'm really proud of, truth telling in archaeology in Australia. Indigenous archaeologists, we're not represented in any of the archaeology departments because, I'll ask you guys why. We're no longer the white elephant in the room. But that's something we're going to lobby for. You can't keep the blackfellas out of our discipline, which you have for 30 years. So folks, get ready, we're coming for you. But it's coming better, and I'm ANU's now looking on and helping us to do these partnerships. So it's the right time, I think.
And how does that work in practice?
So what I'm doing is now mentoring a lot of young students to show them to have courage, what our obligations are to elders, and introducing them in their work to the various community elders. They then have their own relationship with the community elders of that particular part of the country, which will help and speed up their process of becoming effective researchers, or later, tying in as part of that community in some form. I take them to meetings, I liaise so they can get up and do the good thing. I'm teaching them how to deal with communities, mining, ANU, ethics, collections, getting permissions. So I'm taking them to my meetings, seeing how I operate, asking them to improve the way. I'm a bit old-fashioned. So now I'm teaching others, young ones, how to do it, bringing them on board, mentoring and the various ways, and being strong as Indigenous people, being strong in your studies, introducing communities so they get to trust you, and knowing that is a lifelong trust that you can move on, but you can't betray that trust, and never do it for your own personal gain over your community.
And what about the broader discipline? How are you trying to influence that?
One of the things that I was proud to establish was the Australian Indigenous Archaeologists Association. Myself and colleagues as the founding chair. And this year, with the destruction of the Juukan Caves by Rio Tinto, I've been talking and lobbying for Indigenous heritage reform for many years. Since the 2000s, the heritage legislation under the EPBC Act just collapsed to allow the states to have various levels of Indigenous heritage legislation that would allow the boom of the mining boom to go ahead. We've been lobbying and speaking out for the wanton destruction and demise of the Commonwealth's responsibility to heritage protection and our nation's heritage. We've been lobbying that for years, and just the last week we ran a session and I presented a paper on Towards an Ochre Charter, which we're highlighting the elements that we need and goodwill to ensure that the country, Australia, is adequately looking after its amazing Indigenous heritage. We do have that, and that's probably the end of my privilege of what we do and work with communities. We can't just, at the moment, for a bit of greed, allow our heritage to be blown away. I also have issues with the international media that spruik this mining boom, but also do not pay due attention to our heritage. And I think the Commonwealth has an obligation to maintain international minimum standards to protect and look after our heritage, Indigenous heritage, which I argue, and this is the key point, the Indigenous heritage of Australia is all Australians' heritage. I think Australia has an identity crisis with our multiculturalism. We flag our European history, but we're more than that. If we were to embrace our 70,000 Indigenous heritage, which are the tree roots and foundations of any nation going forward, and have truth-telling in our history, have acceptance and respect for this unique heritage, and make it ours collectively and look after it, educate our public about it, we can then embrace our multicultural stems that we are and go forward as a nation. And I think this COVID and Black Lives Matter around the rest of the world, which we really haven't dealt with here adequately yet because of COVID, but I hope that we do, will bring this issue to the fore, and that we can have meaningful, non-racist, but truth-telling, and a country that's proud of itself, its history, and its peoples. And that, I think, is a basis that we can go forward. So archaeology has a key role, and the history, but true archaeology. And when I reflect to our colleagues in Indigenous archaeology, in the Australian archaeological discipline, okay, folks, think about, it's not just about you making your name and doing the archaeology, it's about you're studying Indigenous heritage, and we need to do that in partnerships, equitable partnerships. And this is the change that I and my colleagues, Indigenous colleagues and others, want to emerge and continue in our little role to pursue that equitable partnership within the study of archaeology in Australia.
So what challenges are ahead? What do you need to overcome?
We're pushing for Indigenous heritage legislation reform. But one of the things there, it's tricky. We need to have independent voices and people to push and lobby for that reform. We cannot have those and be aware of those advocating for reform who have been complicit in the government funding or the Native Title Council funding doing the agreements with these mining companies, have been complicit in the destruction of these sites. Our communities need to have independence, and we need to have those speaking for us to declare a conflict of interest if they are indeed sponsored by the Australian Minerals Council. So heritage reform is a big one.
And how do you plan to do that?
How can we do that? And I realise if governments aren't going to do it, we're going to get out to the people. We're going to do documentaries. I'm bringing farmers and Aboriginal peoples together and others. People who care about their families, their land, actually have more in common. And that means farmers and Aboriginal people. So we're doing wonderful projects out at the property Millpost in Golian, where we brought the Ngunnawal Ngambri elders with the Vincent family at Golian and the Watson family at Millpost, having these partnerships. The farmers have been protected these major important sites we found, an axe quarry at Millpost, an ochre quarry at Golian property, protected them on the state Aboriginal places list, looking after the sites, and the communities are working really well. So I'm doing more of that, and it's a natural thing. I think there's a discord between what the government is doing and its blight on Indigenous heritage and peoples to what the public feel. So we're using that. So I'm shamelessly doing more documentaries to get the information out there, which I feel governments are failing to do, and we need to let people know about and celebrate this wonderful heritage and our wonderful people. And the last one on that is I've been privileged to have got the role as the new host for Coast Australia Series 4 with Neil Oliver and Dr. Tim Flannery and others. And if I may put a plug in, I would like to use that international, it goes to 22 countries, profile to seek and lobby for funding to do our own Australian Indigenous archaeologists documentary with our peoples about our heritage. We don't need any more white fellas telling us about our heritage and making a name. We want to do that ourselves. So if I may, any viewers who would be interested to help sponsor or help us to get an Australian Indigenous first ever archaeological documentary series to tell about our history and heritage, our way, with our people, please get in contact with us. That's my big aim for the future, is to share and get it out to all Australians so that we can make our own mind, oh, this is important or not, and help to protect our sites and heritage. It shouldn't just be Indigenous peoples. It's something we need to let everyone know about. And then I hope that all Australians can then meaningfully, through education, know the richness and variance of Australia's Indigenous heritage throughout time, that we can all share and value it, respect Indigenous peoples, respect our values to this country and our place, and embrace that themselves as all Australians, and that we can all go into the future a little wiser, kinder, knowing and being proud of being Australia through our shared heritage.
Thank you for joining me, Dave Johnston. That brings us to the end of another episode. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries, please become a patron at patron.podbean.com/foreign countries.